Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we drift into a world of feasts and gatherings, where tables were not just set for meals, but for power, for art, and for spectacle. From ancient palaces to Renaissance courts, the banquet was a stage, a place where food and music wove together to tell stories of wealth, politics, and culture. Across vast civilizations and shifting empires, these banquets were more than mere indulgence. They were performances, gentle scandals, whispers of strength, and reflections of a world that was constantly unfolding. Whether you're here to fall asleep or wander through the history of these grand gatherings, I'm glad you're here. So, wherever in the world you're listening from tonight, I invite you to settle in, breathe deeply, and let the rhythm of this story carry you. Now, let's begin. The night begins quietly, with a gentle frame around the mind. The air feels still, and the voice drifts forward slowly, drawing no urgency, only calm. Tonight the story is about feasts and tables, about the long banquets of nobles during the Renaissance. They were gatherings of food, of music, and of spectacle, remembered as both refined and excessive. The telling will not be rushed. It will move with the rhythm of a soft stream, patient and steady. The tale begins at the start of the Renaissance, when noble courts in Italy, France, and beyond began to use the banquet as a sign of power and taste. The banquet was more than a meal. It was a stage. A noble who wished to show strength did not always raise armies or build fortresses. Often, he prepared tables filled with roasted meat, bread baked with spices, and wine poured in endless streams. Candles burned in long rows. Halls were arranged with music and bright colors. The guests were seated by rank, with care given to every place. Those who sat close to the host were seen as trusted and valued. Those who sat far away understood their distance. The banquet was not only about food, but about order. Origins of these feasts reached back to the medieval courts, yet in the Renaissance the scale grew larger. Italian city-states competed with each other. Florence, Milan, and Venice looked to outshine rivals through art, architecture, and banquets. Families such as the Medici brought musicians, poets, and actors to their tables. The banquet became both theater and ceremony, blending the arts of the kitchen with the arts of display. To eat was to see, and to see was to judge the greatness of a family. The food itself carried meaning. A whole peacock, roasted and served with its feathers reattached, was not simply eaten. It was presented as a sign of wealth. Sugar, which was rare and expensive, was shaped into sculptures of towers, ships, and animals. Guests admired these creations before they were broken apart and consumed. Each dish was meant to surprise. The more unusual, the stronger the message that the host could command the rarest goods and the finest cooks. In this way, the banquet became a performance of abundance. The sound of music floated through the halls as courses were brought in. Lutes and viols played slowly. Singers recited verses. Between the dishes, dancers entered, performing gentle steps in time with the instruments. The banquet was long, lasting hours, with food arriving in waves. Guests ate slowly, not to satisfy hunger, but to witness the unfolding of the host's display. One course might end with fruit and nuts, another might arrive with roasted game, and another might carry fish pulled fresh from rivers. To finish the banquet was to endure a procession of flavor and display, more about patience than appetite. The scandal of these banquets was not always in the food, but in the message they carried. To some, they were seen as wasteful, indulgent, and excessive. Preachers spoke against them, warning that such luxury pulled nobles away from virtue. Chroniclers recorded the sums spent, noting the expense could equal the cost of ships or soldiers. Yet nobles continued, believing that to feast was to rule. A guest who saw such excess would remember, and memory was a tool of power. The banquet became a gentle scandal, admired by some, condemned by others, but never ignored. Beyond Italy, the pattern spread. In France, the Valois kings held feasts where entire halls were covered with tapestries. In England, the Tudor court arranged banquets where swans were gilded with gold leaf. In Spain, banquets honored marriages and treaties with long tables of almond sweets and spiced wines. Each land adopted its own style, but the rhythm was the same. A noble feast was a signal of control. The table was an extension of the throne. The dishes became words, and the order of serving became sentences in a language of power. Servants moved constantly, unseen yet essential. They carried trays, poured wine, and ensured that candles burned without smoke. The hierarchy extended even to them. Some were allowed near the noble, others remained far. Every action was watched. A mistake in serving could be remembered long after the night was done. In this way, the banquet was both spectacle and test, not only for the host, but for those who worked unseen. The calm order of the hall rested upon many quiet hands. At the end of the evening, when candles burned low and the last dishes were removed, guests rose slowly. They left the hall with full stomachs, but also with memories of what they had seen. The banquet lingered in their minds as a picture of order, of wealth, and of scandalous display. Long after the food was gone, the story of the feast continued. In this way, each banquet became a chapter in the larger history of Renaissance courts. The night does not end here. From the general picture of these gatherings, the story will move more closely into the specific banquets that gained fame, where detail and memory allow us to see more clearly how nobles used the table to shape power. These particular moments hold their own rhythm, carrying the listener forward into the next part of the tale, where the soft telling continues. The story moves forward slowly, with calm attention turning to Florence. In that city, the Medici family used banquets as both a shield and a weapon. Their rise to power was not always smooth, for they were bankers who grew into rulers, and their influence often drew suspicion. To answer doubt, they arranged feasts that spoke in ways words could not. Guests who ate at their tables were reminded of the family's reach. Every dish, every song, and every decoration carried a message. It was quiet, but clear. One famous banquet took place during the 15th century, when the Medici gathered allies and rivals together under one roof. The hall was prepared with tapestries woven with mythological scenes. The light of many candles reflected against silver plates and gilded goblets. At the center of the table, sugar sculptures were arranged in the form of Roman temples, each small column carefully shaped, each roof carved with detail. These were not meant to last. By the end of the evening, the sculptures would be broken apart, but the memory of their presence would remain. To eat sugar in such form was to consume the wealth of distant trade, for sugar came from far lands, brought at high cost. The guests were seated carefully. Those close to the Medici could see every detail of the sugar temples, while those seated farther back had to lean forward to catch the view. The order of seating was a signal. It told each guest where he stood in the structure of power. This silent arrangement was often more effective than spoken words. To be placed near the center was to be valued. To be placed at the edge was to be reminded of limits. The courses arrived in waves, each one carrying its own meaning. Roasted pheasants arrived first, decorated with bright feathers restored after cooking. Then came fish served whole, their scales brushed with saffron to glimmer under the candlelight. After that, pies filled with spiced meats were sliced open, releasing steam and aroma across the hall. Between the courses, musicians played softly, and poets read verses that spoke of harmony, abundance, and fortune. Every pause in the meal was filled with sound, so that silence never settled too heavily. The Medici banquet was remembered not only for food, but for the sense of control it projected. Rivals who questioned their rule could see the number of guests present, the smooth service of the attendants, and the patience of the host. Nothing seemed hurried. Everything moved in slow rhythm, as if guided by unseen order. This steadiness suggested that the Medici family, like the banquet itself, could endure and maintain balance. Not all reactions were admiring. Some observers noted the expense with quiet concern. The cost of one evening could equal the funding of a small military campaign. Preachers spoke against the danger of pride and indulgence, yet even critics could not ignore the impact. To condemn the feast was still to remember it. In this way, the Medici achieved what they sought. They wrote their influence into memory with dishes, music, and careful display. In Florence, such banquets became expected on occasions of marriage, alliance, and celebration. To fail to host a proper feast was to risk shame. The scandal was not only in the excess, but in the pressure it placed upon all nobles to compete. Each family felt compelled to prove itself through the banquet table. This created a cycle where one grand display led to another, until the art of feasting grew as carefully as the art of painting or sculpture. In some ways, the banquet became another form of Renaissance art, though its materials were consumed by the end of the night. From Florence, the tradition moved outward, touching other courts in Italy. In Milan, dukes arranged similar gatherings, but with heavier emphasis on meat and on hunting trophies displayed alongside the food. In Venice, banquets took on a watery character, with fish and shellfish brought in endless supply, echoing the city's connection to the sea. Everywhere the pattern was the same. The banquet was not simply a meal. It was a mirror of the city itself. As the telling continues, the story will move beyond Italy to France, where the Valois court held feasts remembered for their scale and ceremony. These banquets carried their own scandals, as kings used the table to confirm loyalty and to display control, even when the state around them was fragile. From Florence to Paris, the slow rhythm of the banquet remained steady, each dish carrying its quiet message. The story continues with steady rhythm, moving northward from the halls of Florence into the courts of France. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Valois kings of France became known for banquets that were vast in scale. These gatherings were not only meals, but entire spectacles that combined food, pageantry, and politics. The French court was a place where loyalty was shown through attendance and where absence was noticed with suspicion. The banquet table became a long stage upon which the kingdom itself was displayed. The halls of the Valois palaces were immense, with ceilings high above and walls covered in woven tapestries. During a feast, these halls were lit with hundreds of candles, each one steady in its holder, filling the space with a golden glow. The tables stretched in long rows, sometimes in the shape of a horseshoe, sometimes straight, depending on the occasion. At the head sat the king, raised slightly above others, visible to all. Guests were arranged according to their place in court. Every noble knew the meaning of position, for the closer one sat to the king, the more trust one was believed to hold. The The food was prepared in countless kitchens, where fires burned for hours and cooks worked in silence. Servants carried dishes one after another, moving with slow precision to avoid confusion. Meat roasted on spits, turning steadily until it was tender. Large pies filled with game were cut open to reveal steaming contents. At times, even live birds were placed inside, released when the crust was broken, fluttering through the hall as a sign of surprise and wonder. Such tricks delighted the audience, though they were not meant to feed hunger. They were signs of abundance. The French banquets were remembered especially for their desserts. Sugar, rare and valuable, was molded into castles, saints, and animals. These were called subtleties, for they were both delicate and symbolic. A sugar castle might remind guests of the king's fortresses. A sugar saint might show the union of faith and monarchy. Once admired, the sculptures were broken apart and eaten, their sweetness shared among those present. The act of consuming them carried meaning. It was as if the guests themselves absorbed the symbols of the king's power. Music never ceased. Trumpets announced the arrival of courses. Harps and lutes filled the pauses. Singers performed verses that spoke of glory and peace. Between dishes, performers entered to act out short scenes, sometimes of ancient battles, sometimes of allegories in which virtues conquered vices. The banquet thus became not only a display of food, but a lesson in order and authority. Every guest who watched was reminded of the role the king claimed to play in guiding the realm. The scandal of these gatherings lay in their cost. Chroniclers noted the expense of sugar alone, imported from distant lands, as greater than the income of entire villages. Some compared the banquets to theaters of waste. Yet they continued, for to host such a feast was to secure memory. Nobles who attended carried stories back to their lands. They spoke of the king's generosity, of the endless courses, of the marvels they witnessed. Even criticism spread the tale, ensuring that the banquet was remembered. One of the most famous feasts of the Valois court was arranged for a royal marriage. The tables filled a hall so large that some guests struggled to see the king at all. The dishes came in sequence for hours, and the entertainment included a procession of costumed nobles who acted as knights of myth. They paraded through the hall before sitting again to eat. The marriage itself was strengthened by this display, for the memory of the banquet tied families together as surely as vows or treaties. The French banquets influenced all of Europe. Visitors carried the ideas back to their own courts, telling of sugar sculptures and theatrical dishes. In this way, the Valois style of feasting spread, shaping how nobles across the continent expressed power. The banquet became not just a French custom, but a European language of display, understood by all who attended. When the night drew late and the candles burned lower, guests left the hall slowly, stepping into quiet courtyards where the air was cooler. The memory of music, of sweet sugar, and of endless courses lingered in their minds. They carried these impressions with them, speaking of them for years. The banquet, though gone, lived on in recollection, steady and lasting. From France, the telling moves next to England, where the Tudor court shaped banquets into their own form. There, food was gilded, swans were served whole, and halls echoed with their own kind of spectacle. In the next part of the story, the calm narration will walk slowly into those English feasts, where order and excess met in equal measure. The telling now settles in England, where the Tudor court shaped banquets into instruments of spectacle and control. In the reigns of Henry VII, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I, the feast became an essential part of monarchy. The Tudor kings and queens ruled a realm that was both wealthy and fragile, and their tables reflected this balance. The English style of banqueting carried its own rhythm. It was steady, deliberate, and heavy with symbols meant to remind guests of the crown's strength. The great halls of the Tudors were built to impress. Hammer beam roofs stretched above, carved with intricate designs. Long tables lined the space, and a raised dais at one end was reserved for the monarch. From this place, the ruler could see every guest. Light poured from candles placed in tall holders. The smoke drifted upward, collecting under the beams, while the lower air filled with warmth and the faint scent of roasted meat. Every sense was engaged, though in slow and steady measure. The food carried meaning. Swans and peacocks were roasted whole, then covered with their original feathers, or gilded with sheets of gold leaf. These dishes were not served for taste alone. They were symbols of majesty, meant to remind all present of the richness of the crown. Pies were presented large enough to feed many, and sometimes, when opened, they revealed hidden surprises such as musicians or small animals placed within. The banquet was meant to astonish, but always with calm dignity. The courses came one after another, each served in order. First meats, then fish, then stews and pies, followed by sweetmeats and fruit. The Tudors placed particular attention on sugar. Like their French neighbors, they had it molded into castles, coats of arms, and figures of saints. To consume such shapes was to consume a vision of the kingdom itself. Guests did not hurry through these courses. They ate slowly, each dish prepared to last long in memory rather than to fill quickly. Entertainment filled the pauses. Musicians played with lutes and viols, their melodies steady and gentle. Actors entered to recite verses or perform short interludes. Masks were sometimes arranged, with nobles themselves dressed as gods or virtues, moving through the hall before sitting once more to eat. These performances carried lessons of loyalty, order, and divine favor. The feast, in this way, became a teaching tool as well as a display. The scandal of Tudor banquets lay in their cost and their contrast with common life. Outside the palace walls, hunger was familiar to many. Inside, dishes were so plentiful that leftovers piled high. Chroniclers noted the expense of a single royal feast as greater than the yearly wages of hundreds of laborers. Religious reformers warned against such waste, speaking of pride and excess. Yet, like in Italy and France, these words could not undo the impact of the feast. The memory of the banquet was stronger than the criticism that followed. Henry VIII, in particular, was known for his feasts. His court held banquets that stretched late into the night, with music, dancing, and endless courses. These were moments when he displayed not only wealth, but also authority, for the order of the table reflected the order of the kingdom. Even his later years, when his health was failing, were marked by heavy banquets, where the excess of the table seemed to echo the excess of his rule. Elizabeth I continued the tradition, though her feasts carried a slightly different tone. Her banquets often included elaborate masks where nobles performed symbolic roles. The Queen herself was the central figure, and every performance pointed toward her as the guiding star of the realm. In her reign, sugar became even more important. Sculpted figures, animals, and palaces made of sugar filled the tables, admired before being eaten. The banquet hall, in her time, was a theater of loyalty, where every guest was reminded of their place in the hierarchy and of the crown's unshaken presence. At the end of each Tudor banquet, guests left slowly, their stomachs heavy, their minds filled with the images of golden birds, sugar palaces, and steady music. The feasts lingered in memory as proof of the crown's strength. To attend one was to be reminded of power in ways that words could not easily express. From England, the story will continue its slow path to Spain, where the Habsburg court shaped its own banquets with formality and faith, blending the rhythm of the feast with the weight of empire. The telling moves there next, carrying the same calm pace, with no hurry, only steady progression. The story now moves gently to Spain, where the Habsburg rulers held banquets marked not only by abundance, but also by formality and solemnity. Unlike the lively displays of Italy or the theatrical feasts of France, the Spanish court preferred order and restraint. Here the banquet was not simply a moment of indulgence, but a ritual that reflected the weight of empire. Spain ruled over lands that stretched across Europe and into the Americas, and the royal table was meant to mirror the gravity of such power. The halls of the Habsburg palaces were large, but often arranged with greater simplicity. Walls were adorned with tapestries that carried religious images or scenes of conquest, reminding guests of the twin pillars of faith and empire. The tables were long and straight, with little decoration beyond carefully placed silverware and goblets. The king sat at the center, his presence quiet but commanding. Unlike other courts, where nobles sometimes joined in loud music or dancing, here silence was more common. Voices were hushed, and order was carefully maintained. The food reflected this formality. Dishes were plentiful, but their presentation was less extravagant. Roasted meats, bread, and wine formed the foundation, but they were served in strict sequence. Fish was common, especially on days of religious observance. Spices from distant colonies in the Americas and Asia were used, though not in wild excess. Sugar was present, shaped into figures or symbols of faith, but always with dignity rather than playfulness. A sugar cross might be admired, but it was not treated as a spectacle to astonish. It was meant to remind of devotion. What gave the Spanish banquets their character was the atmosphere. Servants moved in silence, trained to approach with measured steps and calm gestures. Guests ate with care, avoiding excess motion. The entire feast carried the rhythm of discipline. The scandal here was not wasteful display, but rather the sheer weight of control. To some, the silence and formality seemed heavy, as if joy had been pressed out. Yet this was the message intended. The banquet was to be a mirror of the empire itself, steady, controlled, and bound by faith. When marriages or treaties were celebrated, the scale expanded. On such occasions, entire halls filled with dishes, including fruits and sweets brought from far colonies. Chocolate, still a novelty from the Americas, appeared at the tables of the Spanish court. Guests tasted it with curiosity, its bitterness softened with sugar. This new drink became one of the quiet luxuries of empire, a reminder that Spain's reach extended across the ocean. To sip it during a banquet was to feel the distant lands folded into the crown. Entertainment was present, but restrained. Sacred music might be performed, with choirs singing hymns that filled the high ceilings with echo. On rare occasions, dancers appeared, though always with controlled movements, never wild or excessive. The focus remained upon the presence of the king and the solemn weight of the crown. Critics observed the contrast between the wealth displayed at these banquets and the struggles of common people. In Spain, too, sermons warned against indulgence. Yet the monarchy defended its banquets as instruments of order. To host a feast was to remind all who attended of the crown's authority, of the reach of its colonies, and of its alliance with the church. The solemn rhythm of these gatherings was not meant to amuse. It was meant to instruct. At the end of the night, when the last course was cleared, guests rose with care. They bowed to the king before departing. The silence of the hall lingered even after they left, as if the very air had been trained into discipline. The Spanish banquet was not easily forgotten, for its memory carried less of joy and more of weight. From Spain, the story will continue to the courts of the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, where banquets carried yet another character. There, the feasts mixed Germanic traditions with Renaissance influence, shaping a rhythm that was both hearty and ceremonial. The narration will move there next, steady and slow, continuing the calm flow of history. The narration moves with calm steadiness into the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, where emperors and electors arranged banquets that blended old Germanic traditions with the Renaissance taste for ceremony. These feasts were not as theatrical as those of France, nor as solemn as those of Spain, but they carried their own weight. They were hearty, filled with food in abundance, and yet layered with strict order, for the empire itself was built on hierarchy. The table reflected the structure of the realm. The great halls of imperial castles were built with stone walls and high-timbered ceilings. During a banquet, torches and chandeliers lit the space, casting shadows across long rows of tables. Guests arrived in procession, each seat determined by rank. Electors, bishops, and nobles were placed according to their standing. The emperor sat at the highest table, raised on a dais, visible to all. His presence was steady and central, as if the feast itself revolved around him. The food reflected both local abundance and imperial reach. Large roasts of boar and venison were common, carried into the hall on heavy platters. Bread was served in great loaves, cut and shared among the guests. Fish came from rivers, fresh and plentiful. Beer and wine flowed side by side, for both were central to the culture of these lands. To this foundation were added finer dishes influenced by Italian and Spanish contact, spiced sauces, sugared almonds, and candied fruits. In this way, the empire's table displayed both tradition and foreign connection. One striking feature of these banquets was the sheer quantity. Chroniclers described tables groaning under the weight of meat, bread, and drink. Servants moved constantly, refilling goblets and carrying new dishes. The pace was steady, unhurried, but unending. The banquet was not designed to surprise with clever tricks. Instead, it impressed by its scale and its endurance. Guests understood that such abundance was possible only through vast resources. Entertainment filled the spaces between courses. Minstrels sang ballads of past emperors. Trumpets announced toasts. At times, jousts or displays of arms accompanied the feasts, though these were usually arranged before or after the main meal. The connection between banquet and martial strength was never far. To eat heartily at the emperor's table was to witness the foundation of military and political order. The scandal here lay not so much in waste or extravagance, but in the reminder of inequality. Ordinary people might eat bread and broth, while nobles at the banquet consumed entire animals, drank deeply, and left much uneaten. The display of hierarchy was deliberate. Every element of the feast reminded guests that the empire's strength rested on clear lines of rank. To challenge the order of the table would be to challenge the empire itself. When treaties were signed or coronations celebrated, the scale grew even larger. Hundreds of guests might be present. Entire barrels of wine were consumed. The dishes could continue for days, with banquets repeating night after night. Chroniclers noted these events carefully, listing each course and each toast as if writing a record of authority. To remember the banquet was to remember the emperor's legitimacy. At the close of such gatherings, guests often lingered. The halls, filled with warmth and noise, stood in contrast to the quiet outside. When at last the music stopped and the torches burned low, the memory of the abundance remained. For months and even years, guests spoke of what they had seen and tasted, reminding others of the emperor's grandeur. From the empire, the story will move next into the courts of northern Europe, where banquets took on the character of colder lands. There, in Scandinavia and other regions, the feasts were shaped by long winters, strong drink, and enduring traditions that blended older customs with Renaissance influence. The narration will continue into that steady rhythm, carrying the tale further without hurry. The story now drifts northward into the colder lands of Scandinavia, where banquets carried a different rhythm altogether. Here, in the courts of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, the feasts were shaped by the long winters and the harsh climates. The cold, which gripped the land for much of the year, created a unique rhythm for the banquets. These were not the grand, endless affairs of the Mediterranean courts, nor the heavy formal gatherings of the Habsburgs, but gatherings rooted in older, more enduring traditions. The food was hearty, the atmosphere warm, and the spirit of camaraderie ran deep through each meal. The halls of northern European nobility were often constructed from timber, their ceilings lower and their walls lined with thick tapestries to ward off the winter chill. The fires in the hearths crackled steadily, and their warmth filled the room, offering comfort against the cold that lingered outside. Here, the banquet table was long, but not as wide as those in southern courts. Guests were seated close together, their voices often raised in conversation, their laughter filling the air between courses. The atmosphere was less formal, but no less important. The food served at these northern banquets was designed to sustain and to fortify. Meat, especially pork, beef, and game, was central to the meal. Roasts were common, served in large cuts, with hearty sauces to accompany them. Bread, dense and often dark, was plentiful, soaking up the rich juices from the meats. Fish, caught from the cold northern seas, also appeared in abundance. For these northern courts, food was not just about display, but about survival. The long winter months required food that could nourish and provide energy for the hard work of the seasons. In addition to these staple foods, beer and mead were central to the meal. The tradition of drinking, passed down through ancient customs, remained strong. The clink of tankards and the slow flow of mead added to the rhythm of the banquet. Wine was a rarity, imported from the southern regions, and often saved for the most important occasions. But beer and mead, brewed locally, were the lifeblood of these gatherings. To drink was to share in the warmth and the community of the banquet, and it was a common practice to raise a toast to the health of the king or to celebrate a successful harvest. Entertainment at these feasts was simple but full of spirit. Bards and minstrels sang songs of past battles, of legendary heroes, and of the gods who had shaped their world. These songs told of the ancient history that bound the people together, of the great figures who had stood before them and laid the foundations for their culture. Sometimes, the banquets would include stories told by the firelight, where elders shared tales of times long past. These were not the dramatic performances seen in the grander courts of Europe, but quiet, intimate exchanges that connected the guests with the ancient past. The Scandinavian banquet was a celebration of survival, of the resilience of both nature and people. It was not about the display of wealth, but about the strength of community. The guests ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the meal, enjoying the shared experience of the feast. Even as they ate, they would discuss matters of the kingdom or their families, often forging alliances over the course of the meal. Loyalty was not displayed through extravagant dishes, but through the simple, steady companionship that marked the evening. The scandal, if any, came not from the excess of the banquet, but from the political undertones of these gatherings. A king's choice of guests, the order in which they were seated, and the toasts that were made could all communicate loyalty or rivalry. In these lands, where power was often contested between families and neighboring regions, the banquet could be a subtle stage for shifting allegiances. A favor given during a toast could turn the tide of a political struggle, while a slight at the table could spark long-lasting grudges. The cold northern climate meant that the battles for power were not only fought on the battlefield, but also at the table. At the end of the evening, when the last tankards were drained and the fire began to burn low, guests would leave the hall, stepping out into the crisp night air. The warmth of the banquet stayed with them as they made their way home, a reminder of the strength they shared in the midst of winter. The banquet was a gathering that reinforced the ties of the community, one meal at a time. Now, the story of the banquet moves across the seas towards the courts of the New World, where European traditions began to mix with the customs of the indigenous peoples. The rhythm of the feast continues, shaped by new lands and new influences. The story shifts once again, now across the sea to the Americas, where European banquet traditions began to mix with the customs of the indigenous peoples. This new world, rich in resources and diverse in cultures, shaped the banquet table in ways both familiar and foreign. The early colonial feasts were held in the courts and homes of explorers, settlers, and nobles, but they soon began to blend with the traditions of the land they had come to inhabit. The rich abundance of the New World, along with the native practices and ingredients, introduced a new rhythm to the banquet, one that carried both the weight of European history and the lightness of discovery. In the Spanish colonies, the tradition of feasting continued, much as it had in the Old World. But now the ingredients were different. The meals in the early colonial halls were filled with the foods that came from the fertile soil of the Americas: maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and chili peppers. These foods were unfamiliar to Europeans, but they quickly became central to the diet. Roasted meats were still present, but now the tables were also covered with dishes of corn, beans, and rice, ingredients that had long been staples in the indigenous diets. The banquet tables began to reflect not only the European customs of power and ceremony, but also the agricultural richness of the Americas. In addition to the familiar meats and breads, dishes made with chocolate, a luxury once reserved for the elite in Spain, found their way onto the tables of the New World. Chocolate, once used as a drink, was now being incorporated into desserts and even savory dishes. The guests who dined at these banquets were treated to the very best that both Europe and the Americas had to offer. The tables filled with fruit from the tropical islands, papayas, pineapples, and guavas, adding color and vibrancy to the meal. The feasts, though still grand, took on a lighter, more exotic air. The indigenous people of the Americas also influenced these banquets, though often in more subtle ways. While the European settlers and noble families retained the formal structure of the feast, they began to incorporate the communal and celebratory aspects of the indigenous meals. In many native cultures, food was often shared in large gatherings where everyone partook in the same meal. This communal spirit began to shape the structure of the colonial feasts, especially in the Caribbean and South America. The banquet became less about display and more about unity, though still under the watchful eye of the colonizers. Entertainment during these banquets, too, began to change. Where once only the formal music of the court was heard, now the rhythms of drums and flutes entered the scene. Musicians played both European instruments and those brought by the indigenous people, creating a fusion of sounds that echoed through the banquet halls. Dances were also influenced by the native traditions. At times, indigenous dances were performed as part of the entertainment. Their movements, once alien to the European guests, now accepted as part of the growing cultural exchange. These dances were not the formal court dances of Europe, but rather energetic and lively movements, reflecting the joy of life in the new world. The scandal of these feasts came not from excess, but from the subtle changes they represented. The Europeans, who had arrived with their own traditions, were now forced to adapt to the foods, sounds, and rhythms of the land they had claimed. Some resisted these changes, seeing them as a dilution of their heritage, while others embraced them, seeing them as a symbol of the blending of old and new. As the European settlers and indigenous peoples interacted, their banquet traditions began to intermingle, creating a new rhythm of feasting that was as much about survival as it was about celebration. The colonial banquets were quieter affairs than those in the royal courts of Europe, but they carried a sense of awe in their fusion. The food was rich, the music was new, and the very nature of the banquet was changing. It was no longer simply a tool of power and display. It had become a symbol of the cultural exchange that was taking place in this new land. The food at the table represented both conquest and cooperation, the old world and the new, the familiar and the strange. The banquet had become not just a social gathering, but a microcosm of the world that was being built in the Americas. From these colonial feasts, the story will move onward to the banquets of the modern world, where the rhythm of the meal has continued to evolve, influenced by centuries of tradition, innovation, and fusion. The feasts of the New World may have marked the beginning of a new kind of banquet, but they were only the beginning of a larger story, one that continues to unfold in kitchens and dining halls across the globe. The story gently unfolds as we move from the rich and complex banquets of the New World to the modern-day feasts that are shaped by centuries of tradition, cultural exchange, and innovation. As time passed, the grand, extravagant banquets of royalty and nobility began to shift into more intimate gatherings. The feast, once a display of power and excess, evolved into something more communal and reflective of modern sensibilities. The essence of the banquet remained, but its form and function adapted to the changing rhythms of the world. In the modern world, the banquet no longer served as a tool of power or a stage for political display. Instead, it became a celebration of connection and togetherness. While the banquets of the past were often driven by hierarchy, where guests were placed at the table based on their status, modern feasts have moved towards inclusivity. In contemporary times, a banquet might be a wedding reception, a family gathering, or a celebration of friendship. It is no longer about demonstrating power or wealth. It is about creating an experience that brings people together, allowing them to share in the simple pleasures of food, drink, and conversation. The banquet tables of today are shaped by the diversity of cultures that have mingled and influenced one another. Globalization has introduced new ingredients, new flavors, and new styles of cooking. Foods once thought exotic are now commonplace, as ingredients from all over the world make their way into modern kitchens. The influence of the Americas, for example, has become deeply embedded in global cuisine, with foods like corn, potatoes, and tomatoes now central to many dishes. Similarly, spices from Asia and Africa have transformed how people approach flavor, with bold and complex spices now common in both home kitchens and fine dining restaurants. Modern banquets, especially those held in cosmopolitan cities, often reflect this diversity. A banquet might feature dishes from all corners of the globe, blending French, Italian, Asian, and Latin American culinary traditions into a single meal. The long tables of the past, laden with roasted meats and sugary confections, have been replaced with smaller, more thoughtfully curated plates. The emphasis is no longer on the sheer quantity of food, but on the quality and the experience of sharing a meal. The banquet has become a more personal affair, where guests are invited not just to partake in the meal, but to enjoy the shared experience of eating together. The rhythms of the banquet have changed as well. Where once the feast might last for hours, modern gatherings are often shorter, more focused on conversation and connection. The formality of the past is relaxed, with guests often mingling in a more informal way. The traditional order of the courses has also evolved. Instead of courses following one another in a strict sequence, modern feasts often feature tapas-style dishes, where small plates are served throughout the evening, allowing guests to sample a variety of flavors at their own pace. The entertainment at these modern banquets is also less formal, with music often playing softly in the background rather than the dramatic performances of the past. In some cases, the focus has shifted entirely away from entertainment, with the meal itself taking center stage. Conversations flow more easily, and there is a greater sense of camaraderie among guests, as the banquet has become a space for shared experiences rather than display. Yet, despite these changes, the core of the banquet remains. The act of coming together to share a meal is still a central part of human experience, a tradition that stretches back to the earliest feasts of the ancient world. Modern banquets may be simpler, more inclusive, and more diverse, but they still carry the same sense of connection and community that defined their predecessors. The meal is still a ritual, still a way of marking important moments in life, whether it be a wedding, a celebration, or a moment of personal triumph. The scandal of modern feasts, if any, is found in the excesses of consumerism, waste, and inequality. While many still enjoy lavish banquets, there is an increasing awareness of the environmental and ethical implications of food production and consumption. The modern banquet must now balance tradition with sustainability, acknowledging the need for more responsible practices in the face of global challenges. This new awareness is reshaping how we approach the feast, with a growing focus on local ingredients, sustainable sourcing, and reducing food waste. As the banquet has evolved, so too has its role in society. Once a symbol of power, it has become a symbol of shared experience and community. Whether it is a casual gathering among friends or a formal event celebrating a momentous occasion, the banquet continues to be a space where people connect, celebrate, and share. The rhythm of the meal, though slower now and more measured, still carries with it the same sense of occasion, and its place in our cultural tradition remains just as important. From these modern gatherings, the story of the banquet takes a final turn toward the future. What will the feasts of tomorrow look like? Will they continue to reflect our evolving cultures and priorities, blending tradition with innovation? Perhaps the banquet will become even more intimate, focused on sustainable practices and mindful dining. Perhaps it will take new forms entirely, shaped by technology and a new understanding of food and its place in our lives. But whatever the future holds, the essence of the banquet will remain. It will still be a gathering, still a shared moment of nourishment, and still a place where people come together to connect. And so, with the closing of the story, the rhythm of the banquet slows, much like the fading warmth of a fire in the hearth. The guests depart, full and content, carrying with them the memory of the meal and the connections made around the table. The banquet, though it may end, is never truly forgotten. It lingers in the hearts of those who shared in it, a tradition that will continue to evolve, but always remain steady in its purpose: to bring people together, to share, and to celebrate life's simplest and most meaningful moments. The story now moves gently into the future, where the banquet as we know it may evolve, shaped by new technologies, global challenges, and changing cultural attitudes. The banquet, though it has remained steady through centuries, is poised to transform in ways that reflect our changing world. As we look forward, the rhythm of the banquet continues, but its form may change to adapt to the needs of tomorrow's society. In the future, the banquet may become even more personal, with technology allowing for more tailored and intimate gatherings. Imagine a world where virtual reality, VR, or augmented reality, AR, brings people together in ways that were once impossible. The banquet might no longer be confined to physical spaces. Friends and family who are separated by distance could gather around a virtual table, sharing a meal in a digital space, experiencing the same sights and sounds, as if they were sitting side by side. The act of eating, once a physical gathering of people, might transform into a shared experience across time and space, where technology bridges the gap between the participants. At the same time, these new forms of banqueting could emphasize sustainability in ways we have not yet imagined. The future banquet may be focused on minimizing waste, with food production and consumption practices designed to ensure that no resources are wasted. In an era of climate change and environmental responsibility, the banquet could become a space where sustainability is a key priority. Locally sourced ingredients, plant-based meals, and even lab-grown meats could become central to the banquet, allowing guests to enjoy rich and flavorful meals while minimizing their environmental impact. These future banquets might also prioritize health and wellness. In an age where nutrition science is rapidly advancing, meals at the banquet could be specifically designed to promote health, with food tailored to individual dietary needs. Imagine a feast where every dish is crafted not just for flavor, but for its nutritional benefits. Banquets could be less about indulgence and more about balance, providing not just nourishment for the body, but also for the mind and soul. Yet even with all these advancements, the essence of the banquet will likely remain the same. It will still be a place for people to gather, to connect, and to share. Whether through technology or in person, the banquet will continue to be a symbol of community, of tradition, and of shared experience. In this way, the future of the banquet will be a harmonious blend of the old and the new, a celebration of culture, technology, sustainability, and connection. The future may also see the return of ancient practices in a new context. Perhaps the communal aspect of the banquet, long associated with indigenous cultures, will come to the forefront once again. Banquets in the future might be less about individual plates and more about shared dishes, encouraging guests to come together and share food in a way that fosters a sense of unity and collaboration. The table could become a space for dialogue and connection, where conversations flow as freely as the wine. The inclusion of diverse cultures will remain central to the future banquet. As global interconnectedness continues to grow, the fusion of different culinary traditions will only deepen. Future banquets might bring together not just regional dishes, but foods from all over the world, blending flavors and ingredients in new ways. The banquet table could become a reflection of the global community, a place where different cultures come together to share, learn, and celebrate their common humanity. The future banquet will also reflect the evolving nature of power and status. In a world where social hierarchies are constantly being questioned and redefined, the banquet may shift from a display of wealth and privilege to a more egalitarian gathering. The power of the table, once used to showcase dominance and control, may now be used to foster equality and inclusivity. Banquets could become a space where everyone, regardless of their background or status, is invited to share in the experience of nourishment, connection, and celebration. As the banquet continues to evolve, it will remain a part of the human experience, rooted in the desire to come together, to share, and to celebrate. The rhythm of the meal will continue to slow, steady, and calm, no matter how the form changes. The banquet, in whatever form it takes in the future, will always be a time to pause, to reflect, and to connect with others. It will remain, at its core, a celebration of life, of food, and of the bonds that unite us all. And so, as the story of the banquet draws to a close, the feast continues in our minds. The memory of the tables, the food, the music, and the conversation lingers. The future may shape the banquet in ways we cannot yet fully understand, but one thing will remain certain. The banquet will always be a place where people gather, share, and celebrate the simple joy of eating together. It is a tradition that will never fade, for it is at the heart of what it means to be human. With that, the tale ends softly, leaving behind a lingering warmth, as if the feast itself were just about to begin, and yet it is already complete. The banquet has come full circle, from the ancient halls of kings and emperors to the modern, evolving celebrations of today and tomorrow. And in the quiet, the memory of the meal continues to nourish, as all great stories do.